scientist and graduate student at the University of Oregon, and I'm also a science communicator. And today I'm going to be talking to you about how studying small octopuses can have a big impact. And I'd like to kind of just start off with what is an octopus scientist. There are many ways to study octopuses. I feel like maybe if you think of an octopus, the first thing that you're thinking about is its ability to camouflage. And so I'm going to show you one of my favorite videos of all time. I've seen it a million times, and it's shocking every single time. So here we've got a rock with some algae, some life growing on it, and almost out of nowhere this octopus appears. And there are a lot of people studying kind of how it is doing this. It's got chromatophores, or these kind of pigment cells, and it also is able to change its texture, which I'll talk a little bit about in a bit. But this is obviously an incredible feat, and we don't really understand completely how they're doing it. And here it is kind of in reverse. So the octopus kind of makes this big scary display when the camera and the scuba diver found it, but before that it is perfectly kind of blended in, and it just seems to vanish. So obviously scientists are interested in how they're doing that. Another thing scientists are super interested in is their 8 arms, kind of how are they able, my videos, there we go. How are they able to kind of form rigid structures without any bones? And there are a lot of people studying that, as well as kind of their suckers and the strength that they have in these arms. And I'm going to talk about some really cool implications to that, or applications rather. Another way to be kind of an octopus scientist is by studying their ecology. And a lot of people are doing that, which involves, come on little videos, involves looking at kind of their size, looking at different species, looking at where they are living, what their diet is, kind of how they're interacting with their environment. And this is a really cool, fairly recent discovery of all of these octopuses that kind of are living together, which is something that octopuses don't normally do. Most of the species are cannibalistic. And when I say most of them, I say nearly every single one besides this one. So this was a really exciting and novel discovery, and people are kind of trying to understand what makes these different. Next slide. Of course, I feel like one of the questions I get all the time is related to their intelligence. And there are, of course, people studying that, kind of looking at their cognition, looking at their ability to solve problems. And so this is kind of one of those classic ones, but with a little bit of a twist on it. I guess not literally, but saying, okay, these animals, we know they can open jars, but are they always going to open the jar? Or are they able to find kind of the fastest solution, which in this case is just sticking the arms directly through the holes in the jar? And it seems like at least this specific octopus maybe was able to complete that task. And the way that I guess I am an octopus scientist is I study their brain, which is a little bit related to cognition, but mostly interested in what is called their visual processing, or how they are thinking about what they see. And their brain is located in between their 2 eyes. It's not up in the head-looking thing, which is actually their mantle. That part contains everything except the brain, really. The ink sac, the liver, the stomach, its 3 hearts. But in between the eyes is the brain, and that's kind of what I'm mainly focused on. And before I get into kind of how I do that, I want to address this question of how did I become an octopus neuroscientist? Because it's not every day that you meet one of those. I feel like similar to a majority of people who got interested in kind of marine life, it started in an aquarium. You can tell kind of by the photo quality here that this was taken, 15 years ago. And I was living in Kansas, so I loved going to the aquarium, but I didn't really have a connection or passion for the ocean because I was in Kansas. And so by the time I was graduating high school, I was like, okay, I love biology, I'm fairly good at it. I love animals, maybe I'll become a vet. But I also, after some thinking about it, maybe a little bit of growing up, I was like, I think that'd be a really depressing place to work. You only go to a vet when there's a problem. I don't want to do that. But luckily, my sophomore year of college, I learned to scuba dive. And that, I feel like, was what really initiated that like passion and spark for the ocean. So before it was a bit more of just an interest, and then I was really full blown, like I want to pursue something related to marine life. And luckily for me, at that same time, I was working with this wonderful mentor who is at the University of Missouri, Manuel Leal, who is kind of referred to in the field as like the lizard whisperer. He studies everything with all different types of lizards, from how they're like moving, what they're eating, kind of their ecology, their evolution, and also their cognition. And so I was in a project that was kind of looking at their problem-solving capabilities and kind of inquiring about what senses they were using in order to solve these problems. And by the time I had come to graduate college, I was like, okay, I need to kind of combine these two passions for marine science and like sensory, cognitive type of research. And it was kind of a no-brainer for me at that point to study octopus, and when you start thinking about kind of cognitive, intelligent creatures. And so now I'm at the University of Oregon, where I spend a lot of time looking at a microscope, looking at very small octopuses, and looking at kind of the even smaller microscopic cells in their brains or their neurons. And I guess this was originally just a picture to say like, and that requires a lot of caffeine. But this does show one of my main funders for my science, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, or the HHMI, and given the recent, that thing, the recent turbulence related to scientific funding and federal funding in general, I feel like it's really important just to say that, like, science needs funding in order to make discoveries, whether it's looking at curing cancer, or how octopus think about what they see. So now kind of getting into how I actually study this. I feel like this is a moment you're waiting for, and I'm going to give you like a left hook. First, we need to kind of understand how we look at humans' brains in order to understand how I'm looking at the octopus brain. And so one way that scientists do that is through fMRIs. And you've maybe had an fMRI or just an MRI, which would be more just looking at kind of the standalone structure. So maybe if you've had a knee injury or shoulder injury, you've had an MRI. But then an fMRI is looking at kind of the functional side of things, so looking at the actual activity. And to study human brains, these are often done by saying like, okay, we want to evoke this emotion, like think about this thing, or kind of leading you through instructions on a task. And then we're able to see where in the brain has the most activity. And we're able to say like kind of where in the brain has the most activity, and then say like, oh, these brain regions kind of care about this thing. And I'm essentially doing the same exact thing in the octopus brain. So I'm working with these tiny little octopuses. They're about the size of your pinky nail, and that is a normal standard Lego, which they kind of use as their like little dens and homes. They love them, and it's adorable. But I can't ask it to like think about something or really probe it in the same way you would a human. And so I just show it movies, which are admittedly pretty boring movies. I am kind of interested in just like really basic visual processing, or how they're thinking about just like super simple things like contrast. Do they care more about black things or white things? Do they care more about circles or squares? And I'll talk about why that is important, but first I'm going to show you, my one piece of data in my scientific talk, which isn't even completely data. It's supposed to be this movie. Maybe. Pull this over. No. well, find me afterwards and I will show you essentially an fMRI on a baby octopus. And kind of getting to this question of why am I doing this, I think that it has a lot of scientific impact on a handful of different fields. One being kind of this evolutionary perspective. So our last common ancestor between us and an octopus was this little worm-like thing that existed about 600 million years ago and had the visual capabilities of a sunflower, which essentially means it knew if there was light or not. It probably didn't even know how much light was around. And that kind of evolved to simplify it in these two different pathways. One, to be vertebrates, which have spines, and the other to be invertebrates, which are cephalopods. We know they don't have spines. And despite this 600 million years of differentiation, that's a number we can't even really fathom, they have kind of evolved a very similar structure to us. And when you look at the visual system, which includes their eyes and their brain. So they have camera-like eyes similar to us, and then their neurons are very similar looking to the ways that our neurons that process and think about vision are, but we're kind of trying to say, okay, did evolution do it the exact same or just kind of similar? And this is getting to kind of more of a bigger philosophical question of is there an instruction manual to build a brain, or are all of these animals doing it all of these different types of ways? And particularly thinking about a brain that can process really complex visual stimuli. So these octopuses are living on coral reefs, which are just buzzing with activity and colors and movement at all times. So in order to take all of that in and be able to perceive and use it, requires a lot of impressive kind of computations to happen in their brain. We want to know, are they doing it the same that we're doing it? Or did evolution build a brain completely differently? Another avenue is through technology. This is true both kind of historically and at the current moment. So historically, they were looking at octopus eyes, which, as I mentioned, kind of have camera-like eyes similar to us, in order to actually make the camera, because they weren't looking at humans' eyes. So it's historically inspired some really cool technology, and then current day, the people are looking at what I mentioned earlier in regards to the arms and kind of how do they create rigid structures without any bones to inspire prosthetics, as well as really strong suction cups that I have heard are kind of being toyed around with in order to do large scale construction. So rather than using cranes to pick things up, you could just use a sucker that just grabs onto it. And I wanted to show this video because it looks like AI, but it's not. Is it gonna play? Of this, what looks like a solid surface moving. And that is some really recent technology that they're calling these complex soft bodies, which this YouTube video explains to you is inspired by the octopus and their ability to change texture. And so they do that with these special cells called papillae, which they kind of show in this corner, which they literally seem to grow out of nowhere. And they are using that to kind of inspire new technology that could literally change and morph in front of your eyes. And lastly, I think that this type of research can have a big scientific impact on conservation. And that I feel like is a little bit of a stretch, but if you start to think of it in terms of what the octopus is doing for the coral reefs that are being bleached, you can think of this as a keystone species, or a species that is really both impacting the reef as well as the other animals that are living on the reef. And so if we can get a better understanding for what these animals care about, which we can't do by asking them, so looking at their brain is one way to do it, then maybe we can get a better idea of oh, if we want the octopuses to stay on the coral reefs that we're kind of building, then we should think about making them this shape, or making them longer instead of taller, or something along those lines. I think while that's awesome, science is just kind of a small part of our lives, and I say that as a scientist. So I think that this research can also have a really big societal impact. One way is kind of inspiring future scientists. And so I do a lot of outreach events like this one, where I'm having children kind of look into squid brains in this example, where this was just like bought from the market, and we dissected it and looked at kind of the biology and the chromatophores and what makes a cephalopod or squid a squid. And through all of these events, I had kind of kids coming up to me being like, oh my god, this is awesome, I want to be an octopus scientist. And I guess little story time of, I then ended up seeing one of those kids at the climbing gym along with their mom, and their mom kind of came up to me and was like, you know, it's not every day that my child comes up to me and says like, I saw a baby octopus in class and I'm gonna be an octopus scientist. And this parent kind of confessed like, I just kind of knee-jerk reaction said like, that's not a real job, what are you talking about? And I feel like it's really important to both kind of inspire future generations, but also inform support systems, which is why I love events like this that are 21 and up, in order to kind of educate, you know, babysitters, siblings, parents, so that when a kid comes home and says like, I want to study how lizards solve problems, people aren't like, what are you talking about? They're like, oh yeah, you know, that's a real thing that you could do and, you know, pursue as a whole career. I think beyond that, this research kind of has an ability to improve empathy in our society. And I think one way that I hope this kind of comes across is that, you know, these animals are so completely different than us, but they are in some aspects seeing the world very similar to how we are. And we know this by looking at their brain and saying like, oh, they do this literally the exact same way that we do. And by kind of finding these similarities, I hope that people, you know, learn to like appreciate and love these animals as much as I do, and hopefully that can kind of turn into a love for their environment and the ocean, and kind of a passion to protect that as well. And on the complete flip side of that, I think that this research also can kind of increase the open-mindedness that we have as a society. And so kind of this idea of, you know, this animal is completely different from us. And while it does some things similarly, it also does a lot of things very differently, just based off of its kind of body plan and how it's shaped, but also how it's thinking about what it sees. It does a few things a little differently than we do it. But that doesn't mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean that it's bad. And I think that if we can kind of take that message and apply it to kind of all animals, but then also some other people, thinking about, you know, just because someone thinks differently due to their background doesn't mean that they're wrong. I think if we adopt that as a society, we'd be able to go a long way. And so besides coming to events like this in order to talk about these things, I also do this kind of form of public engagement through STEAM, which is STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, plus art. And one way that I do that is kind of by putting science where you least expect it, as I've kind of coined it. And an example of this is I teamed up with Ninkazi, a pretty big brewery in Eugene, and was like, I want to make a Kraken beer label and I want you to sell millions of these. And they were like, let's start with one. And I said, okay. So we made a beer label. I say we as I kind of came up with this idea, and it was a little bit of my brainchild, but I also have little to no artistic ability. So I teamed up with a marine biology student at the University of Oregon who made this octopus and kind of helped me create this beer label that they then sold in-house, and it ended up being their like world-breaking or company-breaking beer. They sold the most of this beer than they had of any other beer in their tap house. So that was pretty exciting to be able to kind of share this art as well as this scientific facts about octopuses and research that's happening in the backyard of this brewery. My most recent kind of endeavor in order to do this kind of STEAM project is a children's book that I'm creating called Dreams of a Scientist, Lessons from the Sea. And this book has a couple of aims. One is to educate children, aiming for kind of like a first or second grade level, just about animals and about kind of like new, hot off the press fun facts. And this is kind of pointed out in that piece of that page all the way to the right, where we're highlighting ghost sharks and swordfish and some fun facts that scientists have discovered within the past 5 years about them. This book, I hope also to kind of educate children and their support systems about kind of how marine scientists are doing science. And so this is kind of seen on the left panel here, where people are really using these giant submarines and living on them for days and going down to the depths of the ocean. And one of the last main goals of this book is to kind of highlight all of the scientists who are currently doing all of this work. And so I have 20 scientists from historically underrepresented and historically excluded groups who are going to be real characters in this children's book, which I hope will kind of break stereotypes in regards to who can be a scientist or what a scientist looks like, as well as kind of make these scientists who are currently in the field feel a little bit more included and at home within this field that is honestly not super diverse. And so you can learn more at our website, and we also have these cute marine scientist stickers at the booth, which is, I think, the first or second booth directly here to the right when you walk out this door. And I guess one little favor that I ask is if you do check out our website, you'll land on this homepage and you can read more about the book, check out some of our sketches, learn about kind of what we've done so far and what we plan to do. And then at the way bottom, you can enter your email for an email list where you'll kind of stay more up to date about this exciting project and kind of more events that we'll be having in the state of Oregon. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to my research, kind of my journey, the impact I think that this research can have both scientifically and on society, and I am happy to take questions. Yes.
Hey, what's the purpose behind the species that you selected for your research, or the size of octopus that you're using in comparison to maybe others?
Yeah, the question is kind of why did we decide on the species and specifically the size that we use. And that is a very long story related to the fact that we can't breed, and it's very hard to keep octopuses in captivity. And so it really is just a matter of, this is what is in our backyard. We study the California two-spot octopus, which get caught off of the coast of Santa Cruz. And it really is just a matter of those were the only ones that we could get, which they've treated us well so far, so.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, over here. I think I heard the first half, which was how do we get them to stay still enough, and I assume the second half is for this fMRI. Yeah. And so in order to do that, we do lightly anesthetize them. And so same idea of you're going under heart surgery and you don't want to be moving around, so you're lightly anesthetized. We do the same thing. How do you get a functional scan if it's under anesthesia? You can still open the eye and play videos, which the human brain would do that too, kind of as crazy as it sounds. Yeah, here.
So when you're observing different octopus, are you also looking at the personalities outside of that, and are you kind of noticing anything between how the fMRI is coming across, and is sex playing a role, is age playing a role?
Yeah, those are super great questions, and I would say that the answer is definitely, but that is honestly not something that we're super interested in looking at quite yet. You can imagine that, when an octopus his main goal in life goes from hiding in a little crevice being really small, trying not to get eaten. It's gonna care about different things compared to when it's an adult and trying to find mates. And so I would guess that there are some kind of differences in relation to things like the age, which directly correlates with size. But that is not something we're testing right now. Like I said, we're doing kind of the boring stuff of like, does it care about things that move this way or this way? Yeah, Brent.
So I'm curious, being an organism that has 8 arms, do we understand whether the like visual regions of the brain are like the predominant sense-making regions of the brain as opposed to like the tactile sense-making of the brain?
Yeah.
And like, how do those compare? Do we know that?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Which, if the question was kind of, do we know that they care the most about vision or tactile or like chemosensory, which is kind of their way of smelling? And I think the answer is that based off of kind of brain size, we know that they have contributed a lot of energy. It's like expensive to make a brain. And in their brain, you can see in this picture that I've got up here, the 2 things that look like lungs or kidney beans, those are the spots that are directly connected to the eye. So they're connected to the eye, we know they care about vision, and they're also the biggest parts of the brain. So we can say they care a lot about vision. But I guess all over the brain, but especially in the octopus, it gets a little crazy because their skin can also see. It's been shown if you like take the first layer of skin and you put it in the fridge for a day, and then you take it back out and you shine light on it, it will still respond to light. And so that, adds a level of complexity. I love the jaws on the floor. That adds a layer of complexity. Their suckers can both taste and smell, which, also it's like, how do you do that? And how much do you care about one or the other? Honestly, probably depends on what the task at hand is. If it's finding food, similar to us, like smell is a really big driver there. But if they are like looking for a home, I would imagine that vision would be really essential there. Yes.
What would you say is your most memorable or magical experience with octopus?
Yeah, the question was, what is the most memorable or magical experience with octopus? And I guess the first time some more backstory is that I, as a senior in college, was like, I am doing this, I am studying octopus. But I had never seen one outside of an aquarium. And I'd only seen like the big giant Pacific octopuses, the big red ones. And so I committed to going to grad school to study octopuses, still without ever seeing one or ever doing research on one. And kind of that moment when I landed in Eugene, Oregon, got taken down to the room where they're all housed. It was like, oh yeah, this is what I signed up for, and I'm stoked for it. So the first time that you see an octopus that is smaller than your pinky nail is pretty mind-blowing. Yeah.
So most people have the dominant hand. They're either right-handed or left-handed. Do octopus have the dominant arm?
That is such a good question that I don't know if that has been super well studied. We know that they have kind of dominant sides, somewhat similar to us. Like for most people, if you are right-handed, then you also prefer your right foot when you kick a soccer ball. And we've seen some similar ideas to that in relation to if you put them in a maze and they'd have the option to go left or right, some of them will always choose to go left. And you can kind of train them out of that very slowly, but they, definitely have kind of these innate preferences. But in relation to the arms specifically, there have definitely been some studies that have said okay, let's break down every single movement every time this octopus has gone to get a crab in its lifetime. And those studies have essentially found that each arm always has a role, and it kind of always sticks with that same role. And that changes on octopus to octopus, but kind of the idea that like, if it's catching a crab, the front right one is always going to be moving this way to, you know, go towards the top of the crab, and the left third one will always be going this way to keep the crab from swimming away. Or, yeah, so I guess they can be kind of stereotyped in that way. Awesome, thank you guys so much. Happy to answer more questions, and we'd love